So I played the final transmission and I actually kind of liked it. By the way, I will be saving spoilers until the end of the video and I'll also give a heads up before I do start talking about them. However, I will be using footage from the game. The final transmission picks up after the end of the base game and is a short 1 to 2 hour DLC depending on if you take your time or not. It features 2 new enemies, one of which is a boss, and 1 new weapon. And many of the levels you'll be playing through are mainly just more Black Iron Prison, but the biophage stuff has kind of overgrown the prison a lot more. So it's a little bit different, but not really. That's not to say the game doesn't look good though. However, it doesn't really have as many, oh wow, this place looks really cool moments as the base game does. The new enemy isn't much to write home about either, just because of the game's combat. It does do one thing that's interesting, which is it charges up a shockwave, in which you can either choose to run away and shoot it while it charges it up, or you can keep beating on it while it charges it up and take a little damage. But other than that, it's just more of hold A or D and dodge until the enemy's done with their attack, and then do your Street Fighter combo on them. The new weapon is a hammer, and it's super effective against the enemy I just talked about, which are called the biophage robots. And the interesting thing is it has a heavy attack, which you have to charge up for like, I don't know, half a second. And when you let it go, it does this AoE slam that shoots out electricity. It's kind of cool. And it's meant to be used when you're fighting multiple enemies. Well, the problem with that is when you're fighting multiple enemies, you're getting attacked quite a bit, which makes it a little difficult to use it. Because if you combo one enemy and then you're like, okay, it's my turn to use it, well, maybe 2 of the other enemies fighting you will decide to hit you and knock you out of that charge. So it didn't really feel great to use, so really it kind of just felt like the baton. And now that all the new stuff is out of the way, how does the game play? Well, it's more the same, to be honest. You stumble through Black Iron Prison, sometimes through hallways, sometimes through vents, maybe a big room, and when you unlock the way forward, you'll get jumped by a bunch of enemies, so you clear out with relative ease, and then it's on to the next room, or hallway, or vent. There is one section that was really interesting, though. You need to sneak through a room of the biophage robots, and I thought it was really cool actually because this is a little stealth section. And I mean, there was a stealth section in the base game, but this one just felt better. Unfortunately, like the base game, the DLC has very predictable scares. There were maybe 2 scares that I wasn't actually expecting. And I mean, honestly, on the topic, the enemies aren't particularly scary either. The biophage robot, it's grotesque, sure, but scary? Not really. But the game does do a good job at being creepy. That little nugget fits into the story though, so more on that later. The last thing I want to mention is still, it's so annoying that there's not some sort of waypoint feature like there is in Dead Space, because while the game is kind of linear, there are side areas you can explore. And if you travel too far down the main path, which might not be immediately obvious, those side paths will get locked off forever. To be fair, there probably wasn't anything worth exploring down these side paths anyway, but it still sucks. As for non-spoilery comments about the story, I think it's actually quite good compared to the base game, although that's not saying much. While granted, most of the story is dumped on you at the very end, there are bits and pieces sprinkled throughout the experience, and if you're really observant, you can probably figure out what's going on before the game tells you at the very end. And we're at the spoiler part of the video, so if you don't want to hear those, it's time to get out of here. I'll give you about 3 seconds. So just to quickly recap the ending of the base game, Jacob sends Danny off on the last escape pod while the prison starts blowing up, and he links his core with hers, which means that she can view his memories and other information about him, and he gets killed by Captain Ferris. Turns out Jacob is still alive, although barely. Dr. Mahler finds him, drags him back to her lab, and hooks him up to life support. She does this because she's had a change of heart. She now wants to bring down the warden, Duncan Cole, and his whole space organization by sending Danny information about the prison's ongoings through her and Jacob's core connection. How she had the time to find Jacob's body, drag it back to her lab, and hook him up to all that equipment, and do this data transfer, which supposedly takes a long time, all before the prison exploded, I don't know, but whatever. As I mentioned before, the game taking place in Jacob's head is hinted at quite often, with a lot of enemies popping in and out of reality and a bunch of hallucinations. And while Dr. Mahler is guiding you throughout the entire DLC, she actually doesn't show up in person in Jacob's mind until, well, basically the end where she's killed, but then she still talks to you. So, yeah, that's also a pretty big hint. I do think that the implications that the story leaves the player with is interesting, because, like, what is Danny gonna do with all that information, and what's the warden up to? And I mean, Jacob's definitely dead, but maybe Dr. Mahler somehow makes it out? I don't know. You may have noticed that I haven't mentioned the new boss enemy, and that's because it's the final boss of this DLC, Dr. Mahler as a biophage monstrosity. Her fight is kind of interesting and really boring at the same time because it's more of the same. She walks up and tries to hit you once, and you just dodge and then you hit her back. However, she also has the ability to do a slam attack, kind of like the biophage robots, and she also has a projectile, which she will sometimes teleport before using, and this will reveal a weak spot on her chest, which I think is a heart, I'm not really too sure. Her teleporting is by far the best part of the fight, not only because it's another great hint that something's not right here, but because, well, she's the only enemy in the game that teleports. You've never really had to deal with something like that before. So is the game worth it? Well, this DLC is priced at $15, and while I don't think it's worth that much, I do think they at least put a significant amount of effort into making this a lot more fun than the base game. They tried to spice up the story by adding in the hallucinations and just doing an overall better job with it, and they tried to spice up the combat by adding a new enemy type and adding the hammer, and also the boss did have a new mechanic as well. So again, they tried. However, the game still suffers from its combat. While I appreciate that the hammer and the robots do kind of spice up combat a little bit, it is just not that fun. The environment also sort of just blends together because you've seen it all in the main game as well. It's just more Black Iron Prison, and they don't really do anything interesting with it this time around. And as mentioned before, this DLC is very short. You only really get an hour or two before it's over. And most damning of all is the game just isn't that scary. I mean, it's creepy at times, sure, but it's just not scary, unfortunately. I would recommend the Final Transmission to anyone who really enjoyed the base game and anyone who really enjoys atmospheric horror. If you're thinking of picking up the base game and the DLC for the first time, eh, I mean, you could, but you might as well just play Dead Space.